Thanks for your patience last night. Hope I can pray for more patience this morning. What I want to do is now just focus. There's supposed to be two topics this morning, one on the end-time conception of the Spirit, the other on the temple. As I said last night, I began to talk about the Spirit last night, and so today it's just on this notion that the temple throughout the Bible always has an end-time, new creational tint about it. And I just want to reiterate what Jeff said, that we're not living here in the New Testament way back there, so that we're after all these things. We're still in the midst of what the New Testament is talking about. We need to place ourselves in that midst. And so just a practical application from last night. If we're really the beginning of a new eschatological creation, we're not just like it. We're really the beginning of it, as Paul says in 2 Corinthians 5:17. Then we ought to be a people that are very convicted by our sin. If the Spirit's really begin to create us anew, that Spirit that's going to bring perfect righteousness at the end, we ought to be very convicted by our sin. We're genuine believers. We ought to be a people who are slowly, perhaps, but surely bearing new creational fruit prophesied in the book of Isaiah. These are very practical things. It even gets down to pastoral counseling, quite frankly. And this morning, what I want to do is show how temple then relates to this whole already and not yet end-time new creation idea. And basically, I'm just going to try to show you how I attempt to see the strand of the Bible and how it's unified. Basically, I think that I can summarize everything I'm going to say in just a few sentences here, and that is that Adam should have filled the earth with God's presence and glory. He didn't do it. Noah's commissioned to do it. He didn't do it. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Israel are commissioned to do it. They don't do it. Jesus does it. We do it in Him for God's glory. That's it. I could sit down now. And now I'm going to try to just elaborate. I'm going to try to elaborate for the next till noon. I'd like to start in Revelation 21. And then we're going to go back to Genesis. So Revelation 21, if you look with me there, please. I want to just read a few verses here. This is the great last vision of the book of Revelation. It is the vision it's known as the new creation vision. It's also known as the vision of the new temple. It's also known as the vision of the New Jerusalem. Very intriguing. Why all three? Let's read chapter 21, verses 1 and 2. I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth passed away. There's no longer any sea. And I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, made ready as a bride adorned for her husband. And then let's skip down to verse 10. Carried me away in the Spirit to a great and high mountain and showed me the holy city, Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God. So he's getting a further elaboration of this vision. Verse 11, having the glory of God, her brilliance was like a very costly stone, as a stone of crystal clear jasper. It had a great and high wall with 12 gates, and at the gates 12 angels. So we go through the gates in verses 12 to 13. Verse 14, the wall of the city had 12 foundation stones. And verse 15, the one who spoke with me had a gold measuring rod to measure the city and its gates and its wall. The city's laid out as a square. Its length is as great as the width. He measured the city with the rod, 1,500 miles. Its length and width and height are equal. And you'll notice in verses 18 through 21, the foundation of the city, parts of the city are described with all these precious stones, gold, etc. Now, there is a problem here in Revelation 21, and that is why in verse 1, and notice verse 5 as well, John sees a new creation. We saw that in verse 1, but verse 5, notice he who sits on the throne said, behold, I'm making all things new. So there's another statement about new creation. Why does John see a new heavens and earth in verse 21, chapter 21, verse 1, and yet in the whole rest of the vision, a new creation isn't described? I mean, you would expect, if he's going to have a description of the new creation, say, well, here are the forests and the valleys and the mountains, and John saw them all. It looks like he sees a whole creation, perhaps, and then you localize in a little city. temple in the city. That's like a garden, as 22, 1 through 4 reveal. Is that the case? Why doesn't he describe the rest of the new creation? It's strange. Now, basically then, what he sees, verse 1, new heavens and earth, and new creation isn't mentioned after that. Just a little, apparently, a little city, a little temple in it. It's garden-like. Now, it's interesting as you go down through this passage, if you have a Bible with margins in it, a lot of the verses allude to the book of Ezekiel in chapters 40 to 48, and that great prophecy about a temple. And, for example, in verses 10 through 12, this is partly alluding back to Ezekiel, where there's this high mountain, Jerusalem, with a temple. You can look through a number of those verses. In fact, we could almost say that Ezekiel 40 to 48, this text is saturated with it. In fact, the precious stones forming the foundation in verses 18 through 21 reflect the description of Solomon's temple, which was also overlaid with gold, and whose foundation was composed of precious stones. So really what we find is this is not just a temple in a city. It's a temple city. It's a city that is a temple. So we press the question again. Why does John not see an elaboration of all the creation, forests, valleys, mountains, etc.? He just sees a glimpse in verse 1 and all of a sudden sees a temple city and that's it? Well, maybe. But it is definitely describing in verses 10 to all the way to 22 in verse 3 a temple or a city in the shape of a temple that's garden-like. Notice the garden-likeness in chapter 22. In verse 2, in the middle of its street on either side of the river was the tree of life, bearing 12 kinds of fruit, yielding its fruit every month. And the leaves of the tree were for the healing of the nation. So it's a city, it's in the shape of a temple that is garden-like. In fact, the resemblance to the temple here is amazing because look at verse 16 as well, again with me. It says, the city is laid out as a square. Its length is as great as the width. He measured the city with the rod, 1,500 miles. Its length and width and height are equal. Now that's an allusion, again, back to the Solomonic temple, where the Holy of Holies is described, quote, in this way, in 1 Kings 6 and verse 20. The length and the breadth and the height was equal in measurement. So, this vision, as it's elaborated in 21:10 to 22:3, is describing a city that's in the shape of a temple, and it is garden-like. Now, is this a discrepancy? It is kind of strange to start out, I saw new heavens and earth. He never talks about it again. Just a city that's in the shape of a temple and a garden. And maybe that's all that happened, but it does seem very strange. Perhaps even a discrepancy. But at the very least, it's strange. Some would say, well, this is just, he's an apocalyptist. He sees visions, and kind of like when you dream and have different visions in the night. They don't all seem rationally related, so we can't expect John. He's just writing down what he saw. And let's not try to put that into the box of our Western logical way of thinking. But in fact, I do think that John intends to equate verse 1, he saw new heavens and earth, with the city that's in the shape of a temple and it's garden-like. I think he intends to equate them. And I'll argue that a little bit later in more depth, but let me just briefly argue that now. As we've seen in verse 1, I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth passed away. There's no longer any sea. And then in verse 2, I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem. Now in Revelation, again and again, what you'll find is that one vision explains another vision. They're not just separate often, but they'll explain. And then so he sees the New Jerusalem in verse 2. Verse 3, I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, behold, the tabernacle of God is among men. He'll dwell among them. This is the temple. The tabernacle in the wilderness was later, if you will, concretized in the temple in Jerusalem. So, new heavens and earth, Jerusalem, and in verse 3, a temple, I think they're all mutually explaining one another. These are just different sides, if you will, of the same coin, even though they're 3 verses. So, let me give you an example. Remember in Revelation chapter 5, John hears about a lion who is conquered from the tribe of Judah. That's what he hears. Then he sees a lamb having been slain, taking a book and getting authority. Well, the probability is that the way the lion from the tribe of Judah conquered was by being slain as a lamb. That his death, as we talked about last night, was life. His defeat was victory. Why do I mention that now? Because a vision is often interpreted immediately following. That's the pattern of Revelation. Here we have it. Verse 1, vision of heavens and earth. Verse 2, vision of a city. Verse 3, what does it mean? The tabernacle of God is among men. I can give other examples as well. So I'm going to talk more about why I actually think that the new heaven and earth is equated with the city that's like a temple in garden life. And that it's not just that he sees this big heavens and earth and then you just see a city in it, in a little geographical location. Now, why is this? If I'm correct, maybe that's a big if in some eyes, but if I'm correct that really John is saying that the whole new heavens and earth is a city in the form of a temple in garden life, why would he say that? Well, we've got to understand the whole Bible to understand why he says that, and so that's what we're going to do. We'll go back to Genesis now. In order to solve what I think is somewhat of a problem at first sight, as we talked about here, why talk about what looks like a localized city in the shape of a temple and garden-like and see it as equated with the new heavens and earth? What we need to do is look at the temple in the Old Testament. In the first temple, and this maybe is, for some ears, very radical. The first temple in the Bible is not the temple in Jerusalem. It's not the tabernacle in the wilderness. It's the Garden of Eden. So I want to go back. I want to look at that. And this section on the Garden of Eden is crucial to everything we're talking about because we begin with the garden. So let's see, how was that garden conceived? I think that probably it is to be understood as the first temple in biblical history. You say, it doesn't say it's a temple. Come on. You're reading in your temple theology here. Well, let's remember that just last night as we looked at latter days and that phrase, there are many places in the Bible that doesn't have the phrase latter days that has the concept of the latter days, eschatology. We mentioned Isaiah 65:17. Behold, I created new heavens and earth. That's very eschatological, but doesn't use latter days. I'm going to contend that if we look at Genesis 2 carefully, that the concept of a temple is here. Even though there's not the language of temple that we'll see later, but the Bible does call Eden here in Genesis 2 a temple. So let me try to contend for this because this really sets the pattern for everything. And so let's look at Eden as the first temple. And that it was the first temple, a number of considerations that I present that I believe cumulatively have weight, that it is the first temple. The first one is, it was the unique place of God's presence. Now, of course, the temple was the unique place of God's presence later. And so was Eden. Well, God did appear to people, and he was with people. Does that mean it was a temple? So, that's not a very strong argument at this point. Moses had to go into the tabernacle to hear God speak, and he would communicate God's word to the people. So the Garden of Eden is like that, but that doesn't really demonstrate yet that it's a temple, but it's a beginning. Adam and Eve can experience God's presence and hear God speak in the garden. In fact, the same Hebrew word, verb form for God's walking back and forth in the garden in Genesis 3:8, where he's walking back and forth, it also describes God's presence in the tabernacle. It's, for those of you who know Hebrew, it's the hithbael, hithhalet, walking back and forth. It's kind of a reflexive kind of a thing. And it's found in Leviticus 26:12, and it is found in Deuteronomy 23:14 or 15, depending on versification. 2 Samuel 7, 6-7. Say, well, okay, I don't know. Well, it's a beginning. Second, so that was the unique place of God's presence where Adam and Eve experienced God. Second, Adam, I believe, was the first priest in human history. Come on. There's no word for priest there. Let's go for concepts. Let's not be theologically legalistic, terminalistically legalistic. Let's go for concepts. So, Genesis 2:15, let's read it. Then the Lord God took the man and put him into the Garden of Eden to cultivate it and to keep it. The Hebrew words for cultivate and keep, very intriguing. When they are used together in the Old Testament, they're never gardening terms. Never. This would be the only exception. The word for cultivate in Hebrew is pronounced abad, and for keep, shamer. The two Hebrew words, typically, when they're used elsewhere, mean serve and guard, or serve and obey. And when these two words occur together later in the Old Testament, without exception, they have this meaning, and they refer to one of two things. Number one, to Israelites serving God and guarding His Word, or obeying it. That's 10 times. Or it refers to priests who serve God in the temple and guard the temple 5 times. What do they guard? They guard against unclean things from entering into the temple. If an unclean person came in, they were to cast them out. In fact, you remember when the people apostatized at the foot of Sinai? Moses got the Levitical priests to get your swords on. And they went through. They did some pretty judicial things at that point. And I suspect that the priests had swords in the temple. So Adam was to be the first priest, at least the first worshiper, but I think priest, to serve in and guard God's temple. Now, gardening may be involved. I'm not sure. But if it is, then he is managing and keeping up God's arboreal, garden-like temple and guarding it as a priest. The only difference is it's kind of a natural temple. It's not a human structural temple. So of course the way to manage it is to garden it a little bit. But really, if that is the notion in that first word, then the idea is ultimately he was doing priestly service and guarding. So the idea, and by the way, whenever you get people when they're worshiping, often what comes is a command. If you're going to serve God and guard His Word or obey, you get a command. Verse 16. And the Lord God commanded the man, saying, from any tree of the garden you may eat freely. He gets the first Torah here. Now, there wasn't anything unclean. It doesn't seem to be a good parallel, does it? Because the priests, there were plenty of unclean people that could enter the temple and they could cast them out. But there wasn't anything unclean around the Garden of Eden. Well, maybe except the snake. So yes, there was at least one unclean thing. As we know, when Adam fails to guard the temple by sinning and letting in an unclean serpent to defile the temple, he loses his priestly role, and the cherubim take over that role. Remember, they go to the eastern gate, an entrance to the temple. Quote, Genesis 3:24, God stationed the cherubim to shamer. Same word as in 2:15, to guard. They take over his role. They take over the responsibility of guarding the garden temple. Later, Israel's priests indeed were to guard the temple. They were to keep watch at the gates so that no one should enter who was unclean as well. They were even called gatekeepers in Nehemiah and 2 Chronicles. The role of the cherubim in taking over Adam's role probably is memorialized with the two winged figures over the Ark of the Covenant in the Holy of Holies. That probably memorializes at least part of their role at Eden. The tree of life. Remember, the tree of life is here as well in the garden. And, well, what is that? I think that it's memorialized in Israel's temple, in the lampstand. So, oh boy, this is temple eisegesis, that is, reading in something. Well, you know what the lampstand looked like? If you read it in Exodus, it's got bulbs blooming on it, almond bulbs. There was one stalk going up the center, 3 things this way, 3 things this way. It looked like a tree. It looked like a tree. Lampstand was placed directly outside of the Holy of Holies in Israel's temple, and I think this memorialized the tree of life. Now, that the Garden of Eden was the first temple, I think, is further pointed to by observing that Israel's later temple, if you read in 1 Kings 6, 18 to 29, I just want to describe some of the phrases from 1 Kings in the first temple of Solomon. Listen to the descriptions in 1 Kings 6, beginning in verse 18. There was, quote, cedar carved in the shape of gourds and open flowers. Quote, on the walls of the temple around about and on the wood floors of the inner sanctuary were carvings of cherubim, winged creatures, palm trees, and open flowers. Beneath the heads of the 2 pillars placed at the entrance of the holy place were, quote, carved pomegranates. You know, like Solomon, he just wanted some flowers in there, had an interior decorator that liked that kind of thing. Why was it like a garden? To memorialize Eden, I think it cries out. By the way, why was Solomon the greatest king in Israel's history? Why was he an expert botanist? I think, again, it calls to mind Adam from the Garden of Eden. Furthermore, just as Israel's later temple was to be on a mountain, Exodus 15, and its entrance was to face east, so also Eden. But if you read Ezekiel 40 to 48, which is prophesying an end-time temple, it's intriguing. It was on a mountain too, and it faced east, and water was coming out from the Holy of Holies. And so also you got water coming out from Eden itself and watering the garden. You say, wait a minute. It doesn't say that Eden was on a mountain in Genesis 2. Well, at least it was on a hill. Got water flowing from it. But Ezekiel 28 twice says that the Garden of Eden was on the mountain of God. You read Ezekiel 28. So no doubt about it. The Garden of Eden was on the mountain of God. Now, in the light of these numerous conceptual and linguistic parallels between Eden and Israel's later temple, it should not be unexpected to find that in Ezekiel 28, it refers to this: Eden, the garden of God, the holy mountain of God, and it even says that that cherubic being in Ezekiel, which could be figurative for Adam or for Satan, I'm not sure which right now, but it's a being who was in the Garden of Eden. And it says, you profaned the sanctuaries. In Ezekiel 28 and verse 18. Sanctuaries. Why would the sin of that being in the Garden of Eden, whether it's Adam or Satan, why would it profane the sanctuaries? The plural sanctuaries is a word used for the temple. Sometimes it's referred to the plural because of the outer court, the holy place, and the Holy of Holies being different sanctuarial units to the temple. In fact, in Jeremiah 51:51, it talks about the Babylonian king. He came in and he profaned the sanctuaries of the house of God. This is the clearest place in all of the canon where Eden is referred to as a sanctuary, referring to it as sanctuaries being profaned. You say, wait a minute, there weren't sanctuaries plural in Eden. Well, I think that there were. I think that, first of all, you get from Eden, that's where the water was. The garden adjoined it. Okay? The garden adjoined, was adjoining to the watery source in Eden. Watered Eden. Eden was the garden. I'm sorry, the garden was adjoining, it was outside Eden. The garden was not Eden. Eden was the watery source. That watery source of Eden watered the garden, which was by Eden, and then outside of that you have a third section, which is the inhospitable parts of the earth that apparently Adam was to make hospitable. You have 3 sections. So in the Israel's temple you've got Holy of Holies, and in Ezekiel 48, the Holy of Holies, water comes out from it. Then you have Holy Place, and then you have the courtyard. 3 sections there as well. It's interesting that even some of the earliest Jewish commentators in the 2nd century BC recognize this. And they say this, that the Garden of Eden was the Holy of Holies. That's in the book called Jubilees, not in the Bible. It shows very early, 2nd century BC, they understood the Garden of Eden was, in fact, a temple. In the Qumran scrolls, you have this. They talk about the sanctuary of Adam. Well, these are not inerrant writings, but they show what Jews very early in the 2nd and 1st centuries BC thought. So, not only was Adam to guard the sanctuary, but he was to subdue the earth, according to Genesis 1:28. Now let's look at that. Look at Genesis 1:26 to 28 with me. Genesis 1:26 to 28. And what we're going to see is a couple of things. Non-evangelical commentators say Genesis 1 is one view of creation, Genesis 2 is another view, and they just don't come together. They're in fact contradictory. I don't think so. Let's read verse 26. God said, "Let us make man in our image, according to our likeness. Let them rule over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the sky, over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." And God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Then verse 28, he blessed them, and God said, "Be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, subdue it, rule over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the sky, and over every living thing that moves on the earth." Now, in the ancient world, when you created a temple, this is in the ancient world around Israel, when you create a temple, what you do is you then put an image of the god in the temple. And often the living king was understood to be the living image of the god, like Pharaoh, who was the incarnation of the sun god Ra, and he would be a priest as well, serving in the temple. Now those are just faint adumbrations in general revelation of the special revelatory truth. How natural is it that Adam, being created in the image of God, God would create the temple in Eden and place Adam here as a priest king? It makes wonderful sense. In fact, images were used by ancient Near Eastern kings, and their images were put out in other locations where the king was not physically present to show that he ruled over that. Adam was God's vice-regent, you see. He was the image, and showed that he was the ruler for God who is in heaven. So he is in that temple, but now there's another connection between the commission to Adam in 1:26 to 28 in Genesis 2. And especially in 1:28 it says, God bless them, be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the sky, over every living thing that creeps on the surface. I think as Adam was to begin to rule over and subdue the earth, how was he to do that? I think at the very least he was to make that which was outside the garden hospitable. I think that God's presence in that garden wasn't just to be limited there. I think Adam was to slowly but surely expand the boundaries of the Garden of Eden until those boundaries circumscribed the earth. Circumscribed the earth. So it meant that the presence of God, which was limited to Eden, was to be extended throughout the whole earth. Now, that's a massive statement. Where does it really say that? I want to expand on that statement. That the way Adam was to fulfill the commission of ruling was as he was in the image of God, and as he produced progeny, they were to go out and fill the earth, reflecting God's image, his presence. Yes, this has to do with tilling the soil, with culture, but what you find in many Christian circles is that's what it's limited to. Certainly, essentially, is that filling the earth as reflecting God's image is filling the earth with his presence, among everything else that subduing the earth involves. Now, I want to expand on that a little bit here. On this notion that Adam's role, the way he was going to fulfill Genesis 1:26 to 28, was by keeping that garden in order, managing it, and slowly but surely being a farmer and expanding that garden and making his garden field temple bigger and bigger. So, it is interesting. Against the background, against the background we just talked about, in the light of Genesis 1:26 to 28, Adam's commission to cultivate and keep in Genesis 2:15, then is most probably part of the commission given in 1:26 to 28. To serve and guard in 2:15 is part of the commission, part of the carrying out of that commission in 1:26 to 28. Since ruling and subduing over all the earth is a functional definition of the divine image in which Adam was made, I think we can conclude that his kingly and priestly activity in the garden was not to be limited to its original boundaries, but extended over the whole earth. For example, even the fact, remember, that Adam and Eve were one flesh and they were to have children. And those children were to have children. Just from that point, practically you've got to expand that temple. That garden has got to get bigger and bigger as the human race gets bigger and bigger. You have to have a sacred space that's livable space, if you will. And it wasn't livable outside the garden until Adam, by divine grace, made it that way. Now, I have found corroboration for this perspective not only in a very brief statement by Klein in Kingdom Prologue, which some of you are familiar with, very, very brief, that Adam was to expand the garden, but recently in a commentary just published by John Walton, a colleague of mine at Wheaton, in the NIV Application Bible, commentary on Genesis, I found, after I had worked on this and come to this conclusion, that he's come to the same conclusion. He contends that Adam was much more than a gardener, but was to maintain the created order of the sacred space of the sanctuary. He also concludes that such maintenance indicates that the cultivating, i.e. serving and guarding of Genesis 2:15, is an expression of subduing and ruling in Genesis 1:26 to 28. Consequently, as observed earlier, the priestly role in the garden was to manage or care for it by maintaining its order and keeping out uncleanness. This included gardening, but likely went beyond it to managing the affairs of the sacred place where God's presence dwelt and maintaining its orderliness, in contrast to the disordered space outside. This management included guarding the garden from the threat of unclean things then, so that it wouldn't be corrupted. And would not this management also include Adam teaching God's law to Eve, in order that they both would help one another to obey, so that spiritual chaos and disorder would not set into that temple? Of course, the priest would teach in Israel the Torah. The image, the portrayal, therefore, we have is that of we don't use this word in America, but they do in England, a warden. I once worked in a library, and we had a warden of the library. It wasn't a penitentiary. It was a library. It's weird. They use that word, warden's a manager. So the image is that of a warden managing a sacred ward. As the first couple had children, it is certainly plausible to suggest that the management of the garden extended to teaching them God's law and serving God by obeying it. Walton then says this, quote, "If people were going to fill the earth, we must conclude that they were not intended to stay in the garden in a static situation. Yet moving out of the garden would appear as a hardship, since the land outside the garden was not as hospitable as that inside the garden. Otherwise, the garden would not be distinguishable from that outside. Perhaps then we should surmise that people were gradually supposed to extend the garden as they went about subduing and ruling. Extending the garden would extend the food supply as well as extend sacred space. What this means is that Adam was to widen the boundaries of the garden in ever-increasing circles by extending the order of the garden sanctuary into the inhospitable outer spaces, which includes most of all spreading the presence of God. This would occur especially by Adam's progeny, born in his image, and thus reflecting God's image and the light of his presence as they went out to subdue the inhospitable outer country. Adam, however, failed in the task which he was commissioned to do, as we know. He did not guard the garden, but allowed entrance to an unclean serpent that brought chaos and disorder into the sanctuary and into Adam and Eve's lives. He allowed, rather than ruling over the creation of the serpent, he allowed the serpent to rule over him. And he began to reflect the image of the serpent. They began to lie. Eve blames the situation on Adam. Adam blames it on the serpent. They're hiding from God. So rather than extending God's presence in the garden, they're expelled from it. Adam's commission was passed on to Noah. This is very interesting. In Genesis 9, I want to quote it to you, verse 1 and 6 to 7. God, quote, God blessed Noah and his sons, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. Populate the earth abundantly and multiply in it. And it also talks about them being in the image of God. Noah and his children, as we know, also failed to perform this commission. And then God gave the essence of the commission of Genesis 1:28 to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and to Israel. Now, I want to stop right there. This is massive, what I just said. The commission's not just repeated to Noah. It's repeated to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And this is intriguing again. That non-evangelical scholars have divided the first 5 books of the Bible up into all these sources so that not only would you not relate Genesis 1 to Genesis 2, but the repetition of the language of the Adamic commission in Genesis 1:26 to 28 is so clearly repeated to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Israel, as we're going to see in a moment. I can't find hardly one commentary that says that when Abraham is given this language from Genesis 1, none of them relate it back to Genesis 1. Nor when this language is applied to Isaac or to Jacob or to Israel. It's just called, hey, we got a new Abrahamic promise here. No. As we're going to see, turn with me right now to Genesis 12. Genesis 12. Just as it was repeated to Noah, it's repeated to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So look at Genesis 12. Verse 1, now the Lord said to Abram, go forth from your country and from your relatives, from your father's house to the land I will show you. I'll make you a great nation. I'll bless you. So the notion of blessing from the commission in Genesis 1:26 to 28. I'll make your name great. You'll be a blessing. Emphasis. I'll bless those who bless you. Third point there. And in you all the families of the earth will be blessed. Now, it's especially the notion of blessing that is taken from the Genesis language, but we'll see when it's reapplied to Isaac and Jacob, the notion of ruling and multiplying, and as well as blessing is there. It's clearly rooted back in Genesis chapter 1. The whole note in verse 2, I'll make you a great nation. The whole notion is that they'll become a nation that will rule, as we'll see, as this is reapplied to Isaac, Jacob, and to Israel. We're going to look at a few more texts here in just a moment. So the commission of Genesis 1:28 involved the following elements. Just to review, God blessed them. 2, be fruitful and multiply. 3, fill the earth. 4, subdue the earth. 5, rule over all the earth. So the whole notion in verse 2, I'll make you a great nation, that's multiplication of seed. As well as implicitly ruling. They were to subdue the earth, rule over the earth. Adam was. The commission then to Abraham, I'll greatly bless you, multiply your seed. Here, that's the idea. I'll make you a great nation, make your name great. And then your seed will possess the gate of your enemies. This is reapplied to Isaac and Jacob and Israel. Your seed will possess the gate of your enemies. You'll subdue. Just as Adam was to subdue. But now you got a lot more to subdue. Adam only had a serpent. Now you got a lot of human enemies that need subduing to fulfill this Genesis 1:26 to 28 commission. God expresses the universal scope of the commission by underscoring that the goal is to bless all nations of the earth there at the end of verse 3. See the universal notion? I've argued that, of course, what Adam was to do was extend out, and he was going to create all the nations of the earth himself, and was to extend out in fulfillment of Genesis 1:26 to 28. It's natural, therefore, that in the initial statement of the commission in Genesis 12:1 to 3, that God commands Abraham, go forth from your country, be a blessing, and in you all the families of the earth will be blessed. Just as the Genesis 1:28 commission was initially to be carried out by Adam in a localized place, enlarging the borders of this garden-like sanctuary, so likely It is not coincidental that the restatement of the commission to Israel's patriarchs results in the following. In other words, what you find, every time this commission is repeated, from Genesis 1, 26 to 28, here's what happens. A patriarch, God will appear to them, number 1. Patriarch will pitch a tent, number 2. On a mountain, number 3. Number 4, build an altar and worship God. And number 5, they'll often call it the house of God. Now, why do you have the reapplication of the Adamic commission to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and they start going up to mountains and building altars and worshiping? I think because they're starting over again. I think because just as Adam was to expand the garden temple in fulfillment of Genesis 1, 26 to 28, when Genesis 1, 26 to 28 is applied to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, they see that they're little temple builders. And what they're going to do is expand again. Now, what I want to do is show you some of the other places where this commission is found. And I would like you to turn with me to chapter 22. Chapter 22. And this is now Isaac being sacrificed by Abraham. Abraham goes up to a mountain, builds an altar again, sacrifices Isaac. Of course, the lamb is supplied. So that's the context. And after the ram or the lamb has been supplied, notice verse 17. Indeed, I'll greatly bless you. 22:17. We get the beginning application of Genesis 1. I just want to show this to you so that you can see that it is clearly related to Genesis 1. I'll bless you. I'll multiply your descendants, your seed, as the stars of heaven, as the sand which is on the seashore, and your descendants will possess the gate of their enemies. Blessing, multiplication, subduing. And in all your seed, all the nations of the earth will be blessed. Universal subduing. See, all 4 of those are in mind, just as they were in Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. The only person I have seen who sees the connection between the Genesis 1, 26 to 28 commission and Abraham and Isaac's commission is Tom Wright. And he expresses great surprise. No other Old Testament commentator has seen this, including evangelical ones. Now, you would understand the non-evangelical ones because, they're dividing everything up. Who wants to see continuity? If you don't believe that there's any there anyway. And so, but the evangelicals, they haven't seen it. Gordon Wenham, in his Genesis commentary, mentions it in parentheses. He says, compare Genesis 1. That's it. As far as maybe someone else has done something with it, I haven't run across it. Wright hasn't either. It's a case of myopia. But once you begin to see, you try to look at the broad patterns of Scripture and how they're related, it doesn't take a biblical rocket scientist to see that what Adam failed in and Noah failed in is being reapplied to Abraham, Isaac, and Israel. And just as there was a connection between temple building and carrying out the Genesis 1 commission, so we see little temples beginning to be built again. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Look at another text with me. Turn to chapter 26. Chapter 26. Now, this is the commission restated to Isaac. Okay? Chapter 26. So what am I saying here? I'm just being, of course, in my mind, I think it's just quite simple. Adam was to carry out the commission by expanding the temple in God's presence. Noah was to do it, he didn't do it. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were to do it. I'm just drawing a connection between 1:26 to 28. Genesis 2 is an expanding temple, and this just keeps being repeated. Look at chapter 26. This is Isaac. Verse 23, he went up to Beersheba, and the Lord appeared to him the same night and said, I am the God of your father Abraham. Do not fear, I am with you. I will bless you and multiply your descendants. So we get 2 elements of the Genesis 1 commission. And then what does he do? That's just coincidental. So he built an altar there. And he worshipped. He called upon the name of the Lord and pitched his tent there. And there Isaac's servants dug a well. Got water related there. Turn to chapter 28. This time it's Jacob. So what happens at these sites? What happens? Well, what happens is that God appears to them. They then pitch a tent. It's the same word for tabernacle later in the Pentateuch. On a mountain, where temples were, built altars and worship, and called it the house of God, Bethel. Repeatedly. It's got to be coincidental. Let's look at chapter 26. And verse 11, verse 12, Jacob has a dream. A ladder was set on the earth with its top reaching to heaven. Behold, the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. Now remember that temples linked heaven to earth. And in fact, this is really a stairway. It's not so much a ladder, it's a stairway. In temples, ziggurats in Babylonia, kind of were stairways. They were seen as stairways to the gods who dwelt in their temple in heaven. So it was kind of a temple stairway, if you will, to the heavenly temple. And I think that's partly in the background here. And a number of commentators have noticed that. Notice as we keep going. Behold, the Lord stood up. Your seed will be like the dust of the earth. You'll spread out to the east, to the west, to the north, and to the south, to the 4 points of the compass, in the way Adam should have. And in you and your descendants, all the families of the earth will be blessed. So you get blessings spreading out. And by the way, if the land's going to be given to them, it means it's got to be subdued. So again, those three aspects of the Genesis 1 commission are carried out. Verse 15, I am with you, I'll keep you wherever you go. I will bring you back to this land, I'll not leave you until I've done what I have promised. And what does Jacob, how does he respond? Verse 16, surely the Lord is in this place. Verse 17, how awesome is this place? This is none other than the house of God. This is the gate of heaven. Remember that Israel's temple later, the Ark of the Covenant, was seen as the footstool of God. Why? Because God's on his throne in heaven, and he's pictured as linking heaven to earth with his legs coming down and figuratively his feet on the Ark of the Covenant. Because the temple was a place where God most specially related to his people in a special revelatory sense. Of course, in a general way, God's presence filled everything. But in a special salvific revelatory way, it was in the temple that his presence uniquely appeared. Notice in verse 19, in fact in verse 18, Jacob arose early in the morning, took the stone that he had put under his head, set it up as a pillar, and poured oil on its top. This is related to temple later. He called the name of that place Bethel, which means house of God again, the second time. And then in verse 22, this stone which I've set up as a pillar will be God's house. And of all you do give me, I'll surely give a tenth to thee. The only time we've had a tenth before this is tithing in Melchizedek. Almost always, where a tenth is used, it's a tithe related to the upkeep of the temple. I think it's more than accident that we get the tithe here in relationship to the gate of heaven. Twice it's called the house of God, and this sort of thing. Now, in fact, the combination, when these patriarchs built tents and altars, the combination of tent and altar occur in Exodus and Leviticus only elsewhere with respect to the tabernacle and the associated altar. The word, rarely do any of these words, and these two combinations, ever refer to anything else respectively other than the tabernacle or the temple. Now, why did they build these altars, the patriarchs? Well, certainly though occasions for their sacrifices were an appearance of God and moving to a new place. So when you move to a new place, some will say, Beale, you might be too much here. When you move to a new place and there's no temple anywhere, and you're a worshiper of God, we're going to try to set up something. That's true, but there's more to it. To set up something to worship. There's more significance. The patriarchs appear to have built these worship areas as what I call impermanent, miniature, inchoate, or embryonic forms of sanctuaries that symbolically represented the notion that their progeny were to spread out to subdue the earth from a divine sanctuary and extend it in fulfillment of the commission of Genesis 1, 26 to 28. These informal sanctuaries then pointed to Israel's later tabernacle and temple from which Israel was to branch out over all the earth. These miniature sanctuaries adumbrated, if you will, the later temple. And that they did, it's also suggested by the facts that before Moses, the altar was the only architectural feature marking a place as holy. And that the only time you get altars later, they're incorporated into larger sanctuaries. The small sanctuary at Bethel became a larger sanctuary later in the northern kingdom of Israel, and then it became tainted with idolatry. The result of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob building altars at Shechem, between Bethel and Ai. I mean, Abraham goes into the land, and it's Isaac and Jacob, and they build an altar here and there. I mean, if you look at the map, it's just dotted. What's going on there? Is a temple to arise from each of those places? No, I don't think so. I think that the significance, as they go and dot the landscape of the Promised Land with these little miniature sanctuaries, between Bethel, Ai, and Hebron, near Moriah, it was to show, as Israel's land was being, future land was dotted with these shrines, this pilgrim-like activity was like planting a flag and claiming the land for God, and that Israel's future temple would be built here, and God's people would expand from it. So, I have a number of things here I go into in detail about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob at this point. Let me just see. I've already summarized it orally, so I don't want to read over this part of the material. This is intriguing. The associations with a temple in Genesis 28 are enhanced by the ancient Near Eastern associations of stairway-like structures that connected heaven to earth to allow heavenly beings to descend and dwell in the temple. I mentioned that. This early Jewish commentary, Jubilees 32, says this. Now, again, whenever I mention this stuff to my wife, she said, "Would you quit mentioning this stuff outside of the Bible? I'm tired of hearing about it." I said, "Look, are commentaries in the 20th century sometimes helpful?" She said, "Yeah." I said, "What if we push it back over 2,000 years? Could there have been some saintly Jews who interpreted the Bible? In fact, had access to biblical oral tradition that we don't have access to now, that now is dissipated, and maybe they had some access, and maybe they've got something to help us with here." He said, "Maybe." And then, so, I mean, sometimes these Jewish commentators are wild and crazy. Sometimes they're really good, especially when they agree with me. Jubilees 32, a 2nd century early Jewish commentary, identifies Jacob's building activities here as a temple construction. It says, quote, "Jacob resolved to build that place and to surround the court with a wall and to sanctify it and make it holy forever." Whether he did that or not, I don't know, but it shows that they understood that there was something temple-like about these altars that were being set up. Now, Qumran has a temple scroll. That's very interesting. I just read through the whole thing the other day, and it's how they conceived. They believed that everybody in Jerusalem were apostates. So they go out into the wilderness, they set up their community, and after God defeats the Israelites and the Romans, they're going to build a huge temple, bigger than any temple that's ever been built. It appears to be pretty large and literal. But then the scroll goes on and says, during this time, and it says, during the time when the new creation comes, I, God, will create my temple. So there's going to apparently be, the temple they built will be built by God, perhaps, or after they build their literal temple, God will build the true permanent temple. I don't know which it is, but at some point, God, it says, during the day of the new creation, I'll create my temple, establishing it for myself forever, in accordance with the covenant which I made with Jacob at Bethel. It's amazing. They see that the temple that's going to be built is a fulfillment of God, what God really was promising to Jacob at Bethel, where Jacob builds this small altar-like temple, and where you have the stair of God. But how is a temple, the big temple that God's going to build in the new creation, how is that going to be the fulfillment of what God, the covenant God, made with Jacob at Bethel. Well, remember what the covenant is. It's just the restatement of the Genesis 1 commission. The covenant refers to the threefold promise God made to Jacob at Bethel. And what was it? Number one, that God would be with Jacob and his seed and keep them and bring them back to the land. 2, to possess the promised land. 3, that his seed would spread out to the 4 points of the compass, so that in you, quote, and in your seed all the families of the earth would be blessed. It's got 3 or 4 elements of the Genesis 1 commission. Thus, Qumran. My wife says, don't get too excited. But Qumran interprets, in the 1st century BC AD, probably AD, Qumran interprets the future establishment of Israel's end-time temple and the new creation to be the fulfillment of the Genesis 1:26 to 28 commission. That's amazing. Again, we're seeing this notion that Adam was to fulfill the Genesis 1 commission by building and spreading out a temple. Qumran understood it that way as well. I think that they're just recognizing what's already in Scripture. You'll often find that the interpretative methods of Jesus and the apostles are like Jews in the 1st century. There were some good Jewish commentators. And why could they be similar? Because the Old Testament, later parts of it, exegetes and interprets the earlier parts, and Jesus, the apostles, and some good-minded Jews copied the interpretative method of later Old Testament writers who would interpret earlier Old Testament texts. I think that's what's going on here. Now, for all or some of these reasons, the Aramaic translation of the Old Testament, the Targum, perhaps translated in the 1st century AD as well, identifies the place of God's appearance to Jacob as a sanctuary. Now, it's interesting that, and this may be wild and crazy, it's a footnote, I circled it, I think it's interesting. Some Jewish traditions contend that either at the midpoint or the top of the heavenly ladder that went from, that site of Bethel up into heaven, that at the midpoint of it, it was over the side of Jerusalem where the future temple would be built. That's kind of crazy, but what it does show is they were identifying it, you see, with the temple. The way they got there is a little strange, but they were identifying it with Israel's later temple. Now, I want to say something. This really is going to be weird. Is it accidental? Of course, I'm going to say no. Is it coincidental? I'm going to say no. I'll finish my question. Is it coincidental that at these places where Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob build their altars on the mountain, offer sacrifices, and call it the house of God, that there's always a tree there? Well, let's go back to Genesis. I want to show you the trees. In every one of these places, you can identify trees that we've talked about. I'm sure this is, why would I mention trees? Weird. But let's look at Genesis 12. There's some trees here. Okay, you get the restatement of the Adamic Commission as we saw in Genesis 12, 1-3. Then we go to verse 6. Abraham passed through the land as far as the site of Shechem to the oak of Moreh. Now the Canaanite was then in the land. The Lord appeared to him and said, to your descendants, I'll give this land. So he built an altar there, the Lord who had appeared to him. Notice as we go to the end of chapter 13, verse 18. Abraham is kind of like when we went to the moon and planted the flag there, as if we owned it, to show we owned it. I mean, they're planting these altars to show at some point in the capital of this land, when Israel comes in, it's going to be a big temple. Look at chapter 13, verse 18. Here's another altar building episode. Abraham moved his tent and came and dwelt by the oaks of Mamre, which are in Hebron. Now, do you remember the ram caught in the thicket in chapter 22 that we went over? I didn't mention the thicket, but let me mention the Hebrew word for thicket. That Hebrew word, you just think thorn bush, big deal. The Hebrew word for thicket in Genesis 22:13 occurs only 6 other times in the Old Testament, 3 of which refer to, quote, a thicket of the forest or a thicket of the tree. This is a thicket that's typically identified. It's the kind of thicket that Absalom got terrified. Now, whether they were trees with low branches or trees that just thickets grew around them, I don't know, but they're associated with a tree. Even there, in Moriah, deliverance comes from a tree. So is it coincidental? I don't think so, that they build their shrines in the midst of these places where you've got these old trees. In the light of the links with Genesis 1 to 2 that I've already noted above, the common feature of a tree next to these worship sites where humans experience God's presence uniquely, I think, evokes the tree in the Garden of Eden. It shows further that we've got this garden, we've got the temple building in mind, related back to Genesis. Now, let's go back a little bit to Noah again. That the commission is reapplied to Noah. Wright misses that one because he's so concerned with Israel. But it's clearer to Noah than anyone else that the commission is reapplied. And what does Noah do in Genesis 8:20? Noah built an altar to the Lord, also in direct connection with God's reapplication of the Adamic commission to him. That's Genesis 8:20. Noah built an altar to the Lord, in direct connection with God's reapplication of the Adamic commission to him. Chapter 9, verse 1. In fact, let me just read those because I don't want to appear as if I'm pontificating without any kind of scriptural evidence. Look at chapter 9, verse 1. God blessed Noah and his sons, said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. My gosh. Tell me that's not from Genesis 1? Don't tell me. It is. Notice as we keep reading. Notice verse 6 talks about being in the image of God. For in the image of God he made man. Then verse 7 is for you to be fruitful and multiply, populate the earth abundantly, and multiply in it. Unbelievable. In fact, what does Noah do when he gets out of the ark? He offered burnt offerings on the altar that were a soothing aroma before the Lord, and the only other place where burnt offerings are a, quote, soothing aroma to God is only in the tabernacle. Only. Which is the precursor to the temple in Jerusalem. Noah offers these sacrifices also on a mountain. And it's interesting. Do you remember the first time the distinction between clean and unclean animals is made? Is in the ark. He distinguishes between them. And then when he gets out, he offers sacrifices of clean animals. Well, the only other place where there's this distinction made between clean and unclean animals is where? In the temple. If you're unclean anyway, if you touch an unclean animal, even an unclean animal, then you've got to offer these sacrifices to get clean again, to participate in the worship and participation in the outer courtyard if you're just a regular Israelite. Now, if you're a priest, you can go into the holy place. If you're the high priest, you can go into the Holy of Holies. And by the way, that most commentators, especially Jewish commentators, that Gordon Wenham and others have noted, Noah is an Adam figure. He's not last Adam, he's a second Adam figure. Partly because of the reasons we just talked about here, the commission being reapplied to him. But notice also, how does he end up falling in a garden-like atmosphere, a vineyard? And then his sin is covered. You know, all these patterns recapitulated with Noah. Now I have a section here of how Sinai was a temple. I'm not going to read that. I'd be happy to comment on it later, but I think Sinai was a temple as well, just as were these other smaller temples. But the temple's getting bigger now. Sinai. Okay, it's getting bigger. Now, what appears implicit with the patriarchs and with Moses at Sinai becomes explicit with Israel's tabernacle and temple. On Mount Moriah, remember that's where Isaac was offered in the little temple building episode. On Mount Moriah, David in 1 Chronicles 21, David saw, quote, the angel of the Lord standing between heaven and earth. Here we have a link between heaven and earth again, which is what the temple is all about. Now, what did David do at that site? Remember, that's at the threshing floor of Ornan, where David is sent by numbering Israel's army, and he has to offer an offering and repent. So what does he do? He buys the threshing floor of Ornan, which is on Mount Moriah. And furthermore, at that site, 1 Chronicles 21 says, David built an altar to the Lord, offered burnt offerings, just as the patriarchs, and he called out, Hurrah, in the name of the Lord. He worshipped. And David calls it the house of God in 1 Chronicles 22:1, because this is the site of Israel's future temple, which in the following context, he prepares it for Solomon and to build. So now he does just what the patriarchs do, and now we do get the bigger temple, Solomonic temple, at this site. If you read carefully, 1 Chronicles 21 to 22. These are all the same elements found with the small-scale temple building activities of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, which confirms that their building activities were indeed microscopic constructions of a sanctuary. David's doing the same thing, and now his son's going to blow it up, finally. Now we see that these smaller temple building activities of the patriarchs find their climax with the larger scale construction of Israel's temple. Now this episode that we just talked about in 1 Chronicles 21 particularly mirrors the one with Jacob, where also God and angels appear to him, and there's a link between heaven and earth. In David's case, an angel between heaven and earth. The reason that David performed what I call inchoate, embryonic activities of a temple like a priest, he's offering things, at this site was twofold. From that very site, the temple of Israel was to be built. And second, there's now a formal transition from going from the tabernacle, still in existence, to the big temple. If you want, the concretization of the tabernacle takes place at this time. The tabernacle is actually mentioned here in 1 Chronicles 21:29. He did not go offer in the tabernacle at this point sacrifices, because now he's beginning to establish the big temple that Solomon will expand. Mount Moriah was now becoming the designated place for sacrifice because the temple would soon be built there. As with the patriarchs, there are also links in the Davidic narrative with Genesis 1:28. No, not as explicitly. In direct connection with David's preparations for the building of the temple in 1 Chronicles 29, he praises God in this way. And actually the praise takes the language of the commission to Adam, which is strength. Why would you apply that to God? Because God's the one ultimately who really will carry it out through humans. Let me read it from 1 Chronicles 29. David says, "Blessed art thou, O Lord. Thine is the greatness and the power and the glory and the victory and the majesty. Indeed, everything that is in the heavens and the earth, thine is the dominion." So, again, the phrase, blessed, in the heavens and on the earth, thine is the dominion. Thou dost exalt thyself as head over all. Thou dost rule over all. Genesis 1. It lies in your hand to make great and to strengthen. And then David uses language in this text and kind of applies it to Solomon. Solomon is designated in the following verses as the example par excellence of a vice regent. Quote, 1 Chronicles 29, 23, 25. "Solomon sat on the throne of the Lord as king, and the Lord highly exalted Solomon, bestowed on him royal majesty which had not been on any king before him in Israel." It's probably not accidental that a few verses earlier David refers explicitly to the nation's identification with the patriarchs. He petitions, quote, "the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, and our fathers, that God would preserve the people's godly desires and, quote, give to my son Solomon a complete heart to keep thy commandments and to build the temple for which I have made provision." We're going to take a break in about 5 minutes. But the patriarchs and that Moses and David were building nascent temple structures is further evident from noticing that the same embryonic temple building activities occurred when the remnant of Israel returned from Babylon to reconstruct their temple. Remember, their temple's been torn down. They come back from Babylon, and what do? They go to the foundation of the old temple, which is on Mount Zion, on a mount. 2, they offer burnt offerings. 3, they worship through the playing of music and praising and giving thanks. They refer to it as the house of God, Ezra 4:3. In this situation, however, there appear to be no clear references to Genesis 1:28, nor the Abrahamic promises, but I think they're implicit. Now how about other temples? There is a prophesied end-time temple, and it has the same associations as most of the preceding temple constructions. In Leviticus 26, verses 6 to 12, allusion is made to Genesis 1:28 in direct connection to the erection of the tabernacle in Israel's midst. If Israel is faithful, Leviticus 26 says, God promises, "I will turn toward you and," quote, "make you fruitful and multiply you, confirm my covenant with you, make my tabernacle with you, and you'll be my people." I mean, all in the same breath. Repetition of the Genesis 1 commission. "And make my tabernacle with you." Again, talking about Israel's future end-time temple. Ezekiel 36 to 37 makes the same link. After promising that God would restore Israel and multiply men and make them increase and be fruitful. Ezekiel 36, 10 to 11. God promises a, quote, multiplication of fruitfulness, 36:29-30, so that Israel's formerly designated land will, quote, become like the Garden of Eden, in which God will increase, quote, will increase their men like a flock. Ezekiel 36:35-38. Then in direct development of these preceding ideas and of the Leviticus 26 text, Ezekiel 37:26-28 again refers to that aspect of the promise of, quote, multiplying men, and ties it again to the temple. Here's what Ezekiel 37:26-28 says. It will be an everlasting covenant with them, and I will multiply them and set my sanctuary in their midst forever. Now, there are a couple of differences between what's given to Adam and what's given to Noah, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, especially the patriarchs. For Adam, it was only a commission. When it's applied to Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, it's not only a commission that they're to do this, but it's a promise now. God is going to do it. And he uses the formula, I will be with you. In a number of these patriarchal temple building episodes, he says, I will be with you, I will be. So how are they going to carry it out? God wasn't with Adam, and he wasn't with Noah. He promises, I will be with you. And furthermore, there's a difference. Adam was just to kind of fill the earth. Well, there was one little opponent, but now you've got to subdue a bunch of nations. That's also how it's going to be fulfilled. So, central to the task of spreading out was to extend God's presence. And this is further apparent from noticing that part, and I want to underscore this, that part of the basis of God's promise and commission to Isaac, to Jacob, and to Moses is, I am with you. That's how you're going to do it. You can't do it by yourself. It was this very divine presence that provided the enablement of the task and assured the fulfillment of the promise. In response to God's presence, Israel was, quote, to walk in his ways and keep his commandments, end quote, in order to fulfill the original Adamic commission. Quote, to live and multiply, and that the Lord your God may bless you in the land where you are entering to possess it, Deuteronomy 30:16. Only if God circumcised their heart and was with them internally through the Spirit would they be able to love and obey him, continue in his presence, inherit, perform the promises, and truly live. Now we've got a big problem. That's an amazing promise. It sounds like unconditional. I'm going to do this. Israel failed. Is God unfaithful?